out of control fraud of the federal courts in Wilmington, North Carolina, and in Raleigh, North Carolina. New York State does massive amounts of business, official business, all the time in North Carolina. The basis of denying my rights to sue the state of New York and to sue the perpetrators of the massive dumping and flushing of vast, huge amounts of sewage into Lake Champlain and vast amounts of toxic industrial wastes, the basis for denying my rights to proceed in this case against the state of New York, the International Paper Corporation, and the United States government, the basis of the refusal to allow me to have my due process and equal protection is rooted in the lies, outright stinking fraud by the courts of the United States that New York State doesn't maintain sufficient minimum business contacts in North Carolina. The precedent case that they relied on was International Shoe versus the state of Washington, wherein an out-of-state party must maintain sufficient in-state business activities and contacts in order to invoke the jurisdiction of the federal court on the out-of-state defendant. International Shoe versus Washington State, the precedent case. Well, in my particular case, I revealed that New York State engages in tens of thousands of business visits and business trips and engages in vast official business in North Carolina, absolutely destroying the federal court's lies. They just lied about it. They made it up. They made up this garbage, this lie that I couldn't invoke the federal courts because New York State doesn't do business in North Carolina. Well, Judge Terrence W. Boyle and Judge Myers and all the other judges of the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals and the judges and clerks of the U.S. Supreme Court. That's nonsense. Y'all are full of baloney. New York State's busted and the courts are busted for making it up as they go along. This idea that New York State doesn't do vast amounts of official business in North Carolina is an absolute lie. It's not true. It never was true, and it never will be true. And I have been 100% correct all along. Now, the courts don't want to deal with that lie. They keep evading the discussion of it. They don't want to admit that, gee golly whiz, Mr. Witham is correct here, and we're shown to be incorrect. So they avoid the discussion at all costs of anything that even is relevant whatsoever to this New York State doing vast amounts of business within the jurisdiction of the federal courts in North Carolina. The Secretary of State for the state of New York provided me 8 years of the business trips of New York State officials into North Carolina, comprising 496 pages of an Excel spreadsheet showing vast amounts of travel expenses of New York State officials into North Carolina, doing massive amounts of business in North Carolina virtually every day, and it's still ongoing. But the courts in Wilmington, the federal court in Wilmington, Judge Myers, Richard E. Myers from the Bahamas, or Jamaica, something like that. He's from Jamaica or the Bahamas. He avoids and insists on not discussing or dealing with or explaining why it is that New York State does, in fact, do huge amounts of business in North Carolina, and that all the previous rulings against me by the federal courts, in my case, against the state of New York and International Paper Corporation and the United States government for massively poisoning Lake Champlain and flushing the Lachute River using the Lake George, New York Lake George waters as a giant toilet flusher. You can't make this stuff up, folks. They lied about the official business of New York State in the courts of North Carolina. They know it's not true. They know I'm correct, and Judge Terrence Boyle in the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals in Richmond, Virginia, and the U.S. Supreme Court that rubber stamped the whole case outright are totally incorrect. And now they're concealing it. Now they're covering up just exactly the same way that Andrew Cuomo, the governor of the state of New York, covered up the records on the massive deaths of huge numbers of COVID patients in the senior citizens' homes in New York State. They're concealing the facts, they're concealing the truth, and they're refusing to even discuss it. Because Judson Witham is 100% correct. He was shafted, cheated, swindled out of his due process and equal protection rights because Judge Terrence W. Boyle decided to make up this whopper that New York State doesn't maintain sufficient minimum contacts in North Carolina's federal court jurisdiction. It's not true. It's not even remotely true. And they all know it. So now we're doing the Andy Cuomo, apparently, and we're covering up. I guess this is how everything gets rigged. I guess this is how the deep state works, or in this case, the deep federal judiciary. They're covering up for the massive poisoning of Lake Champlain and the Richelieu River and the St. Lawrence Seaway and the Great Lakes and rivers and streams and creeks and groundwater and estuaries and offshore all over the United States. Because they don't want the reality of the fact that the government itself is massively responsible for and liable for these massive dumpings of chemicals and sewage spreading COVID-19 all over the United States because of the policies, the customs, and the practices of the United States government and the state governments and the banks and their insurance companies and all their bar lawyers. Judge Richard E. Myers, the injunction that you've placed against me allows me to object, and I'm objecting for all the reasons stated above. New York State does massive amounts of business in North Carolina all the time, and under the precedent dictates of international shoe versus Washington State, I have absolutely shown to the federal courts and the world that the rulings of Terrence W. Boyle in every case I filed in Raleigh are just absolutely fraudulent. 100% unsupported, Judge Myers. And, you know, we're talking about my parents and everything they ever worked for, and my family and our property, our business, our home, 600 acres on Lake George. And you might kind of detect a bit of venom in my discussion of these issues and how absolutely outraged I am about it. New York State likes to hide records. New York State likes to refuse to cooperate in open records requests. New York State likes to lie and cheat and steal and kill people. And that's exactly what they did to my parents with their flushing of all that sewage and industrial waste into the front of Fort Ticonderoga on the bottom of Lake Champlain. And there's more evidence of the facts and the truth of what I just said than you can ever cover up with your, New York State doesn't maintain minimum contacts in the federal court jurisdictions of North Carolina, which is absolutely 100% not the case. It's not true. It's fraudulent. Now, I noticed throughout your recent rulings and dealings with my pleadings, you don't want to touch that issue with a 100-foot pole. You don't discuss it. You don't refer to it. The clerk of court files my documents as documents. There's no mention of the fraud. There's no mention of the skullduggery at work here, because I'm going to tell you something. Lake George is full of sewage that drains from 6,000 septic tanks into the lake. And the only way they can keep that lake from going full green, algae bloom, nasty is to flush the lake. Flush, using the dam system down the Lachute River. The Poop Chute River, where they flushed all that international paper company slop, 1.5 million, 1.5 million cubic yards of slop, chemicals, sewage, and toxic wastes right in front of the most iconic piece of American real estate you can think of. Right out in front of Fort Ticonderoga on the bottom of the lake where they hid it for decades. They hid it and poisoned Lake Champlain on a grand massive scale doing it. And the United States government and the state of New York and the state of Vermont and the chronicles of human history reflect that what I just stated is the way it is, Judge Richard E. Myers. And to Terrence W. Boyle, fantastical story. Oh, yes, you betcha it is. A fantastical story. The flushing of Lake George, New York. It's a fantastical story, Judge Terrence W. Boyle. So, ladies and gentlemen, I object. I object to every time you threw my cases out. I object to it all, because all you've done is deny me my human rights, my due process rights, my rights to a jury trial to let them decide the facts, and my rights to the equal protection of the law. You've court raped me, you've court stripped me, you've imposed these absurd, ridiculous, heightened pleading standards on me, and now you've slapped an injunction on me, only allowing me to object. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I object. I object on steroids. I object. I enter this exception for the record before the court of the people of Earth, because the United States government, the state of Vermont, the state of New York, and a whole bunch of their hooligan slob industrialists who packed their pockets with campaign donations have poisoned America with their dams, their dams used as toilet flushers to flush sewage and toxins all over the United States. These dam systems are used to flush the dilution of the pollution to the solution. Judge Richard E. Myers, Judge Terrence W. Boyle, and all the other judges that have been involved. Flush, and dilute the truth. Cover up the truth. Hide the truth. The truth is, New York State does massive official business and North Carolina, and the mandates of International Shoe versus the state of Washington have been, on a grand, massive scale, shown to be in my favor. My favor. Not the lies and the covering up and the fraud of the federal judiciary. And that's why I'm suing the United States government, and that's why I've asked for all you federal judges to get off the case and assign it to an international court. Because there's something smelly going on here with the dams, the damned dams all over America being used to flush massive amounts of virus and bacterial infected and contaminated water down the rivers into the oceans. The flushing of the Great Lakes down the St. Lawrence Seaway with the Moses Sanders Dam is an excellent example of what they did on Lake George, New York with Dam A, dam number 230, which is thoroughly discussed back in 1970, by the way, when the state of Vermont sued the state of New York and International Paper Company for flushing just exactly as I've stated it in this video. So ladies and gentlemen, there you have it. The United States government is a defendant. Judge Richard E. Myers is a defendant. Judge Terrence W. Boyle is a defendant. The United States Supreme Court is a defendant. The Appellate Court of Charlotte, Virginia, or Richmond, Virginia, is a defendant. Because this fraud that New York State doesn't do massive amounts of business in North Carolina is the biggest whopper, I believe, I've ever witnessed. Judge Richard E. Myers, I object.